This episode of Harvey Brownstone Interviews is brought to you by the Harvey Brownstone Talk Show Blend Coffee, available at hollywoodblends.com. Everyone's saying it's the best coffee they've ever tasted. Why not give it a try and see for yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a producer and author who is instrumental in preserving, perpetuating, and honoring the legacy of the most popular and beloved vocalist and entertainer of all time, Frank Sinatra. His close association with the Sinatra family, which has been ongoing for over 40 years, began in 1984 when, at the age of 18, he became the president of the Sinatra Society of America. That position allowed him to get to know Frank Sinatra and his family and evolved into a full-time job, culminating in his current position as Senior Vice President of Frank Sinatra Enterprises. He's produced several books about Sinatra, starting with The Sinatra Treasures, intimate photos, mementos, and music from the Sinatra Family Collection, which is filled with never-before-seen photos, letters, and mementos from the Sinatra family archives. Then in 2007, he released Frank Sinatra, The Family Album, which chronicles the private life of the iconic star, filled with rare photos and first-hand recollections and stories from his family and close friends. And then in 2015, to commemorate Sinatra's 100th birthday, our guest, in conjunction with Sinatra's 3 children, released a book entitled Sinatra 100, which is an intimate and dramatic visual portrait of Frank Sinatra, revealing many of the previously unseen moments in a remarkable life. Our guest also wrote the beautiful commemorative programs for the 2 groundbreaking multimedia concert productions, the first one in 2003 at Radio City Music Hall, entitled Sinatra, His Voice, His World, His Way, and the second one in 2006, Sinatra at the London Palladium. He produced a wonderful documentary called The Rat Pack Captured, as well as the 2011 TV special Sinatra Sings. And he was an executive producer on the excellent 2015 miniseries Sinatra, All or Nothing at All. He's produced dozens of albums and box sets, including some of my favorites, Frank Sinatra, Nothing But the Best, Frank Sinatra, Vegas, and the Rat Pack Live and Swingin', the ultimate Rat Pack collection. And if all of that weren't enough, our guest also produced a fascinating book entitled The Copa, Jules Padel and the Hottest Club North of Havana, which is a beautiful illustrated history and a mesmerizing look behind the scenes at the legendary Copacabana nightclub in New York. I'm delighted to welcome Charles Pignone to our show. Charlie, thank you so much for being here.
Harvey, my pleasure. Thank you for having me as a guest. I appreciate it.
When I was doing my research for this interview, Charlie, I read that by the time you were 8 years old, you were already completely immersed in the music of Frank Sinatra. Your parents must have had great taste in music.
Well, I was very lucky and I'm in California now as we speak, and I've been here for 30 plus years. But I grew up in upstate New York in an Italian family that played Frank Sinatra. And anybody that knows, back in the 60s and 70s, there was a picture of the Pope and there was a picture of Frank Sinatra in every Italian house. And I was lucky because my grandfather was in the vending business and he had about 100 jukeboxes in the tri-state area. And when I was old enough to help work with him on the weekends, in those days, those jukeboxes had about 80 to 100 songs. I would say 50 would stay the same all the time, but once a month you'd swap in whatever the newest hit was. But he had a warehouse where he had they would send 45s and albums and everything. And so I grew up with that music, and it's been in me. I can't think of a day that, being 57 now, that my recollection that I haven't heard the voice of Frank Sinatra. I can tell you, if you're interested, when I first became aware of Frank Sinatra.
Sure.
Yeah, so 1974, Frank was doing this huge concert called The Main Event at Madison Square Garden, produced by Jerry Weintraub. My grandfather, who I said was in the vending business, knew Frank, not well, but he knew Frank Sinatra through doing benefits for Teamsters and stuff like that. And my grandfather got 4 tickets to that show. And my mother's sister, my aunt, lived in Parsippany, New Jersey. And we drove from Albany to go to my aunt's house, and my aunt and uncle, mother and father went to see the main event. It was broadcast live on television. We were able to stay up and watch it because we were looking for our parents in the audience. That was the first exposure I had to seeing Frank Sinatra. I subsequently told Frank Sinatra that story 20, 15 or 20 years later, and he absolutely laughed because I said the first time I was actually really saw him in concert, even though not live, but on television, was watching the main event. But we were watching to see if we could spot our parents, and we never did. But yes, so I was 8 then, born in 1966. So that's when I became aware of Frank Sinatra, but I heard the music all my life.
Now, as you know, Frank Sinatra is commonly referred to as the defining voice of the 20th century. You were lucky enough to attend dozens of his live concerts during the last decade of his performing life. Are you able to put into words, Charlie, what it is about Sinatra's voice and his personality that captivated the world so much?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say. I don't know what that X factor is, but as you mentioned in discussing his life, which was very well lived, I think the best compliment that can be paid to him is he was first and foremost called the voice. He is the voice. He is an American original, but although that influence and impact is felt worldwide, but I think his music moved people because when they heard him sing, he was singing about a human feel and emotion, and he simply had a way of touching people with that music that was unique. A lot of people felt that he was singing specifically to each person, but there was something in him that Frank Sinatra, when you hear him, it's for me and a lot of people, it's not background music. If you're in a restaurant or something, you can hear music and you just ignore it or you talk on. For me, when I hear Frank Sinatra, I'm compelled to listen. I can't explain what that X factor is. He had something that just resonated with his generation and continues to resonate with generations. I hate to say and be wrong, but I think he's just as popular or more popular now than he ever was, although he's not here for people to see him perform live, which was the ultimate thing next to an album or to hear a recording. But, I think we need him now more than we ever did.
Oh, I agree. In 1984, when you were an 18-year-old college student, you became president of the Sinatra Society of America. And for a number of years, you traveled with Frank Sinatra on the road. How well did you get to know him?
I think most of my conversations with him were regarding music. And I think that created a bond between him and myself. He always had said previously that he hoped when he stopped working or after he passed on that future generations would find his work. And so I think me being that age and having access to him and talk to him, and it was about music, it resonated with him because here was somebody from generations after he started interested in his music. So I think he took a liking to me then. At one time, somebody asked me to calculate how many concerts I went to over the years. So I started in 1984. I was in college. And in those 4 years, during the summer breaks, I would go see him in Atlantic City or Las Vegas. And then in 1988, when I graduated from college and came out to LA, I would guess that I saw 90% of his performances until he retired in 1995. They would have me travel with his group and with the musicians. I was really good friends with his musicians. I was very lucky. I think I saw, if I calculate 50 to 60 concerts a year, and you have to remember in those days when he was playing Las Vegas, some of those on the weekends, he would do 2 shows a night. So he would play the Golden Nugget and he would open on Wednesday or Thursday. He'd do 1 show and then Thursday or Friday and Saturday, he'd do 2 shows. So if I was in Las Vegas, sometimes I would see 5 or 6 shows. I probably saw close to 500 shows, and I'm really blessed. But I think next, outside of his family and close friends, I was probably as close as you could get to him in those years.
You've just mentioned how many concerts you attended. I mean, you saw him in Vegas, Atlantic City, you were at the Meadowlands, you were at the Royal Albert Hall. Is there one performance that stands out in your memory as being particularly memorable?
Yeah, there was a wonderful, speaking of the Meadowlands, when he turned 75, his daughter Tina was producing a special that would be on CBS. And as part of that special, they were taping him 2 nights at the Meadowlands Arena. And those shows, the first night, he had a cold and nobody was sure if he was going to make the 12th, but he did rally. And it was a wonderful show. And he was very touched and moved because out of those 17 or 18,000 people, after one of the songs sang happy birthday to him. And then after that show was over, there was a small select group of us that were invited to a private birthday party that was held at the Waldorf Astoria. And I think there were about 10 tables of 10 people. And we all had dinner. And this was after the concert. So it didn't start till midnight or something. And we all had dinner. And I think might have been Steve Lawrence or Robert Wagner, but somebody got up with a microphone and went to each table. And there was somebody at each table that spoke for the table. And then at the very end of the night, we all got in a line and went up to his table to say happy birthday to him. Each person got a chance to say happy birthday to him. I'll never forget that night.
What a night. Now, your relationship evolved from being a fan to becoming a full-time employee of the Sinatra family. Can you take us through how did that happen? Who approached you to work for the Sinatras?
There was, well, I was very lucky. There were a lot of people that supported me and helped me during the way. There was a Sinatra Society in this country, in America. There were various Sinatra societies, Sinatra Society of Japan, Sinatra Society of Australia. It's hard to imagine how popular this man was from the 40s on. There was a man named Scott Sayers out of Texas that had the Sinatra Society. When I got on the Sinatra radar, I had placed a call in 1983 to his office. And he had a secretary there named Dorothy Ullman who had worked for him for years. But as I mentioned about my grandfather was in the jukebox business. I had heard a song on the radio called Here's to the Band. And I just assumed, oh, this is going to be a hit for Frank Sinatra. I loved it. I have to preface by saying I was a huge New York Yankee fan. So around 1980, they started playing Frank singing New York, New York at all those games. So months went by and, it never came to the warehouse. So I said to my grandfather, how can we get this single? So he said, call the distributor. This is years ago, there were one stops where you would get albums and records that distribute records. They didn't know anything about it. My grandfather said, call this number, which was the office for Frank Sinatra. I talked to Dorothy Ullman. I had asked her to can you send me Here's to the Band? And about a week later, I received a padded envelope with 145 of Here's to the Band. And I called her back and I said, I think you misunderstood me. I'm looking for like 100 of these. And she laughed. And I told her I had joined the Sinatra Society, and the man that was running it, Scott Sayers, couldn't do it anymore. So she put me in touch, or had Lee Salters. Now, Lee, anybody that knew entertainment, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Lee was probably the top publicist in the world. He handled Barbra Streisand. He handled Michael Jackson. He handled Frank Sinatra. So I got a call from Lee Salters. He had an office in LA and New York, Salters, Roskin, and Friedman. Asked me how old I was, interested in taking over the Sinatra Society. Talked to Scott Sayers. You get a mailing list. I will have you come to Atlantic City, take a picture with Mr. Sinatra. Now you have to remember there was no internet, there were no cell phones. The reason that Frank Sinatra society was so valuable to fans was that the office, Dorothy Ullman, would send me Mr. Sinatra's itinerary months in advance. And in those days, which seems foreign to people now, they would book their trips to Las Vegas or Atlantic City based on who was performing there at the time. Now, when you go to Las Vegas, you go to the airport and you see who's there. And I know, because of my relationship with Steve Wynn and people in Las Vegas, 80 to 90% of the tickets are purchased the day before or the day of the concert, unless you're going to see Adele or booking in advance. But people wanted to join the society because I had the itinerary. And so I would put out 6 times a year a newsletter, and there'd be an updated itinerary. And we also put interviews in there with musicians and clippings. And I worked a lot with Lee Salters, and then Lee's daughter, Susan Reynolds, became Frank's publicist, and she would send me material to put in there. but it was mainly in the early years when there was no internet or access. I do remember when I first started doing it and put out the first or second newsletter, some people who had been members for years, fans who had followed him. There was a group in Philadelphia that went to see him at the Earl Theater in the 40s. They knew Frank. They'd go to Atlantic City all the time. They were screaming at me because I had dates in there for May, Frank Sinatra at the Golden Nugget, and they were calling the Golden Nugget, but the Golden Nugget wouldn't confirm it. The Golden Nugget would never confirm it because the room in the Atlantic City, the theater ballroom, sat about 500 people. Steve Wynn actually had a really smart idea. He used Frank Sinatra in commercials, but he also knew that high money people, high roller people wanted to have access and see those shows. So he did not put a lot of tickets on sale. He really didn't have to advertise Frank Sinatra being there. But to make a long story short, most people wanted that itinerary because they were going, you could go see Frank Sinatra. He was working a lot in those years.
What's your principal role as Senior Vice President of Frank Sinatra Enterprises?
Well, I mean, his family has been really diligent preserving their father's legacy. I don't think there's any other artist from Sinatra's era that is still as respected and relevant to today's generation. A lot of that has to do with the talent, but a lot of that has to do with the family's diligence. And we licensed his name and likeness. There's a lot of sync, which is putting his recordings in movies, television, commercials, etc., around the world. We're taping this. I don't know when this will air, on February 12th. Yesterday was the Super Bowl. Anybody who watched the beginning of the Super Bowl might have caught. We opened that show on CBS with Frank Sinatra singing My Way and some performance clips interspersed with players from the NFL talking about their journey, how they made it to the Super Bowl. He's just, my job isn't hard. It's not easy. But as I said, there are certain people that there are no generation gaps. And it's really being diligent and not, there are not a lot of licenses we do. We do not put his name on anything that comes over our email or requests. I can tell you that every year we get 200 to 300 requests to put his name on something. The family's very diligent. If it's not authentic, we won't do it. So we look at projects that have authenticity. We look at projects that will bridge the generation gap and also perpetuate the legacy.
A big part of your work involves releasing new albums and compilations. Is there more music or more concert videos coming out in the foreseeable future?
Oh, there is. We were sidetracked because of COVID. And there's a lot of younger generation today is into vinyl. They want LPs. And there had been, well, prior to CDs, most record companies own their own LP pressing plants. When CDs came around, LPs practically vanished. It was a niche market. They've since become more popular. And it's very hard now, post-COVID. Before that, if we wanted to put out an album, I could put out a CD and an LP version, and I could get it done, meaning remix and master, whatever we had to do in the artwork, 3 months. If I had it done in January, it could come out in April or May. Now, because there's not a lot of vinyl pressing plants, especially in the United States, there's a 6 to 8 month lead up, and you have to get a slot. And because we're Frank Sinatra and we're with Universal Music Group, who's our distributor of the music, we still get a little priority, but we still have to wait a long time. But yes, there is a lot of music. There's a lot of concerts. There'll be a lot of things coming out. We always have a 3 to 5 year plan, and we stick to it pretty closely. COVID did sidetrack us. The last project we just put out last year in 2023 was Platinum, which was a 4 LP set and a 2 CD set to celebrate the 70th year that he signed with Capitol Records. And we put out Platinum. And it was 4 LPs, and the last LP contained rare and unreleased material. So yes, there is a lot of stuff in the vaults. As I always say to a lot of people that ask me a similar question, when you're doing a Sinatra project, the man had such a career with depth and breadth that the problem is not what we include, it's what we have to exclude. So yes, we do have a lot, and hopefully the best is yet to come.
Oh,
Pardon
that's
the
a
pun.
perfect way to say it. The best is yet to come. I know you've worked very closely, Charlie, through the years with all three of Frank Sinatra's children, Tina, Nancy, and Frank Sinatra Jr., who passed away tragically in 2016 at the age of 72. I want to ask you about Frank Sinatra Jr. Why do you think his career never really took off the way, for example, Liza Minnelli's career did, even though they were both children of great legendary stars?
Frankie was a very close friend. He was like an older brother to me. We just clicked when we met. There was no bigger, people tell me I'm a Frank Sinatra expert. Nobody knew more about the music than Frank Jr. I actually miss that I can't pick him up and call him because he was a wealth of information and he was at a lot of those sessions. I don't know if Frank was a wonderful singer. He's a lot better than a lot of the people that are singing that music since his father and other people. I don't think he had the drive his father had, and plus I think being saddled as the son or daughter of a famous entertainer, it would be like if your father was LeBron James or Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio. Not easy to be that because you have a standard that nobody can really meet. But he was a wonderful man. He was a great friend to me. He actually, when I met Frank right around when I started working for his dad in '84, became really good friends with him a couple of years later. He when I told him I was going to get engaged and got married, he had just moved into a new house in Beverly Hills. He hosted my wife and I, Lori's wedding at his house. He was just a great friend. It's a tremendous loss, not only musically, because after his father stopped working, he then embraced that music and was doing a show called Sinatra Sings Sinatra. I actually produced an album for him called That Face on Reprise, which was his dad's label, where we took arrangements that were written for his father that Frank Sr. never did. I don't think he had the drive, and plus you have to realize the music business had changed. So that type of music was not that Frank Jr. loved, that his father sang the Great American Songbook, was not the music of the day, like when his dad was becoming a singer. So that's strike one right there. It wasn't played on the radio, not easy to hear, not easy to access. Wonderful man and a really great singer, and I miss him every day.
Yeah, he was a great guy. I remember seeing his show in Las Vegas. Do you think that Frank Sinatra could have done more to help his son's career?
Well, I think in '68 or '69, Frankie did a show for Monsanto, and that I think was on CBS, a special, and his dad showed up and sang a duet with them. He was on the Duets 2 album, and I remember talking to Frankie when his dad called him in 1988, and his father asked him to come on the road and be his musical director and conductor, and keep Bill Miller, who had been with Frank Sr. as his pianist and sometimes MD and conductor since 1951, for Bill to be at the piano and for Frankie to conduct. So Frankie was on the road, and he would actually put together, in the later years, he would put together the lineups and go over them with his dad, and he would really handle the rehearsals. He'd get there like a couple hours before with the orchestra, and then Frank Sr. would come in, and Frankie would tell him, these are the new songs we're putting in. You have to rehearse these and that. Frank, I don't, in my honest opinion, I don't think Frank Sr. could have performed as long as he did, especially in the later years, without Frankie being there.
Oh, that's good to know. How involved are Tina and Nancy in Frank Sinatra Enterprises?
Oh, they're very involved, but I mean, Nancy had her own career and was a singing star in her own right, and is now, with the help of her daughters, especially her daughter Amanda and AJ. There's a company called Light in the Attic Records. She's now reissuing a lot of her albums, and Amanda wrote a book about her mom that's fantastic. It's got a great interview in there that nobody could ever get Nancy to talk about stuff like her daughter Amanda. But Tina is really I think Frank wanted it that way. Tina has more of a business sense than Frankie or Nancy, and is just more of a natural at being involved in the business. Tina is the one person that I speak to or talk to daily, or we travel, or we do this or that, or is in on every decision made by Frank Sinatra Enterprises.
In 1992, Charlie, there was a miniseries called Sinatra that was executive produced by Tina. What did you think of it?
I enjoyed it very much. Speaking of Frank Sinatra Jr., I remember Tina, we were on the road and Tina had sent Frankie a couple VHS tapes a couple months before it was came out. And I forget where we were. It might have been in New York City. And Frankie had a suite at the Michelangelo Hotel, and he invited all the musicians in the orchestra to come. And we watched in 2 nights. He ordered food, and we watched that miniseries couple months or weeks before it aired. I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed it very much.
There's also a 2003 movie called The Night We Called It a Day, starring Dennis Hopper and Melanie Griffith, about a scandal that erupted during Frank Sinatra's 1974 tour of Australia. What did you think of that movie?
You know, I have to be honest with you, I never saw that movie. I've heard about it. I know it's about Frank went to Australia in 1974 and was hounded by the press and said some things that offended the press, and then the unions wouldn't let him leave. They wouldn't fuel his plane. He wanted to get out of there. They did make amends, and he continued the tour and finished up and did a television show. But there was one thing that I do know about that. I certainly wasn't around at the time of that tour, but in speaking to musicians who were with him at the time, like I mentioned, Bill Miller, who had been his longtime pianist, and Al Viola, a wonderful guitarist who actually started working with Frank in the 1940s. He was part of the Page Cavanaugh Trio, and they did some recordings at Columbia and some live events. But Al and Bill both told me that if they looked out their hotel window, the people of Australia were cheering on Frank and saying, go ahead. They didn't like the tabloid press either. I think it was conveyed in a different way over here in the United States. And I think a lot of people said Nixon was so happy about it because for a few days it took Watergate off the pages that Frank Sinatra was being held in Australia.
Yes, exactly. It did.
Yeah.
Now, in 1998, there was an HBO movie called The Rat Pack with Ray Liotta playing Frank Sinatra. Did you see that movie?
I did see that, and I thought I was lucky enough to know Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. very well, not Dean, but Sammy, because in 1988, Frank devised a tour called Together Again, where he wanted to bring Dean and Sammy together. And the whole motivation for that was Dean Martin had lost his son the year before. Frank thought Dean was in a deep depression and thought, let's get him out on the road and like old times and get his mind off losing his son. It didn't, there was a huge tour planned. There were three, if I'm remembering this correctly, because I'm older, there were three arena shows, Oakland, Vancouver, and Seattle. And then we went to the Chicago Theater, and Dean did 3 nights at the Chicago Theater. And on Sunday night, unbeknownst to Frank, left the tour. Sammy and Frank finished the spring tour, and then when it picked up months later, because they took the summer off from the tour to do their obligations in Vegas and Atlantic City, Frank and Sammy, then they changed the name of the tour. They got Liza Minnelli and they called it The Ultimate Event. I did see that movie, and all I can say is, having seen these three together and seen the movies of Ocean's 11, they really all loved each other, almost like brothers. So you can't manufacture that camaraderie on film, on stage. They just had a love for each other that those are competent actors, but I didn't get the feeling that they had the same relationship that Frank, Dean, and Sammy had that you see when you watch Ocean's 11 or Robin and the Seven Hoods. These guys really loved each other. I mean, one of the only times I ever saw Frank Sinatra shed a tear was after a Radio City Music Hall show when they had to tell him that Sammy had passed away. So he loved Sammy Davis and he loved Dean Martin, and I don't think you can manufacture that. The Rat Pack.
I don't think you can either. In 2003, there was a TV movie called Stealing Sinatra about the kidnapping of Frank Jr. Frank was played by James Russo. Do you have an opinion about that movie?
I actually saw that movie, and I will tell you to reinforce what a good guy Frank Sinatra Jr. was. His manager was the sister of Andrea Kaufman, her sister Marta Kaufman produced Friends, television show Friends. David Arquette is also in that movie, in Stealing Sinatra, who at that point was married to Courtney Cox. Andrea said to Frank, they want to come to the show, the people in the movie. And Frank, they did come to the show as his guests, and then we all had dinner with them afterwards. Uh, the kidnapping for Frankie was very traumatic, besides being kidnapped. But then anybody that knows the history of that, one of the lawyers there manufactured a story trying to say that maybe Frank Sinatra was involved in it for publicity, which was not the case. And even the kidnapper said that, but it tainted. That story was around for years. Frankie actually did not, there's a law, I'm from New York, and there's a law called the Son of Sam law. At one point, I think David Berkowitz was his name. I lived through that. I was a kid. He tried to write a book or sell something, but they passed a law where criminals cannot benefit from selling their story if there was victims, which doesn't it seem that's obvious, right? It should be obvious. Frankie did a lawsuit, and not to try to stop Stealing Sinatra, but there were other people that were trying to write a book, or one of the kidnappers. And I think it went up to the California Supreme Court, trying to say, how can anybody profit from a crime? Just terrible. But as I said, he was a really good sport. He met with the actors. I can't tell you if he ever saw the movie, because he didn't really talk about it. All he would say to me was, a lot of it has been misrepresented, and you don't know the fear. He never felt any fear, that like the night that he was kidnapped. And I do remember him telling me once, he would, because I was very close to his mom, Nancy Sr., that his main concern was how his mother's condition, how once his mother found out, that was Frankie.
Would you like to see a feature film made about Frank Sinatra's life the way they did about Elvis? Or do you think Tina Sinatra's miniseries is the definitive movie?
Believe me, Tina is very supportive. We've been trying, I can't tell you how long, at least 20 years, to get the right script and the right people involved. She's not looking for a whitewash, but we're looking for something. What a lot of people don't understand is you don't have to make anything up. Frank Sinatra's life in itself and the stories are so compelling and so entertaining, but you're always going to get somebody who's trying to write something and they go off on a tangent, and she doesn't want anything that does not, I remember one of the scripts was written, and I read it and I said, it doesn't ring true. She sent it to Quincy Jones, and Quincy Jones said, this is not the Frank Sinatra I knew. I can tell you, up until right around COVID, we were working with Netflix and a wonderful writer named Bill Condon. Bill Condon, if you look him up, he did the Twilight movies, but he also did Chicago, and wonderful writer. And Bill had a wonderful take on it. And it just, through things that happened, it didn't. But it's something that we are always looking at and pursuing, because there's a whole generation that don't know about the life of Frank Sinatra. And if it can be portrayed right and to show the character of the man, I think it's something that Tina Sinatra and the family would embrace.
Oh, I'd love to see that happen. When we had Frank Sinatra's former publicist, Jim Mahoney, on the show, I asked him, what was the most misunderstood thing about Sinatra? And he said it was the persistent rumors that Sinatra was heavily involved with the mafia or the mob. Do you agree that that's the biggest misconception?
Well, that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Me being Italian, I would say to people, they would say to me, well, you're Italian, the mafia made Frank Sinatra. And my response to them was, if the mafia made Frank Sinatra, they would have made 100 of them. They would still be making Frank Sinatra. The mafia cannot make people buy 300 million albums. They cannot make people fill the Meadowlands Arena. Frank Sinatra, when he grew up around that element. You have to remember, after Prohibition, most of those nightclubs, I wrote a book on the Copacabana. It was fronted by Jules Bedell, but it was owned by the mobsters. Jules was just put in there as the front man. Those people hired him. He was friends with them, but did they hired him too when his career was on the skids. But there is no, they cannot, put a gun to anybody's head and make them go see a concert, make somebody as popular as Frank Sinatra was. Like I said, the easiest thing to say is that people don't want to recognize that it was his talent and his drive. That's why Frank Sinatra was who he was. He had that talent, he had that drive, and he was relentless in trying to be the best he could be. He would be like, it's like if you see Fred Astaire dance on the screen, it looks effortless, but you don't know it unless you read the hours and how Fred Astaire's feet would bleed that people put in to make it look effortless. And Frank Sinatra did the same thing, just very diligent and just very focused on their career. Do I discount that they made his career? Yes. Will I deny that he knew those people? Absolutely not. I knew people in the mafia. They ran Las Vegas for years, and most people that can bridge that gap will tell you that Vegas was a better town when they ran it than it is now. The corporations are worse than the mafia. I'm not making excuses for the mafia, but I'm just saying that no, I don't. That is probably one of the other probably biggest misconception about Frank Sinatra is his character. And to those who never knew Frank Sinatra personally, he was a wonderful singer and a great entertainer. But to those of us who did know him personally, he was a wonderful friend. There wasn't a better friend you could have. Quincy Jones said it best. There was no gray with Frank Sinatra. It was all black and white. If he loved you and he would do anything. If he didn't like you, get out of the way.
Well, anyone I've ever interviewed who had anything to do with Sinatra has said that the one quality he insisted on in people who surrounded him was loyalty. Did you find that to be true as well, Charlie?
Absolutely. There was nobody, and that continues with his family. Again, in 1984, this April will be 40 years I've been associated with the family. Since I got out, since Frank stopped in 1985, I've been working with the family, and there's an attorney that's been there longer than me, Bob Finkelstein, who actually deserves a lot of the credit. He was very close to Frank. He was engaged to Tina at one point. He's the children's attorney. And Bob, there's not anybody else there's nobody better with intellectual property or copyright laws, right of publicity, but he loved Frank Sinatra. And we always take the position that any decision we make, what would Frank do? We take the position as, are we going to get a call after we do something from Frank? We want him to be happy. So every decision is based. The edict from Tina is, do it as if my father was here. But yes, there was nobody loyal. There were, like I said, Bill Miller started working with him in 1951 as a pianist and was with him until the end. Frank Sinatra gave loyalty and expected loyalty. I wish there was more of that in the world, not just with people, but with business and associates that you deal with. Yes, he was very loyal.
Now, as you know, there's a lot of books out there about Sinatra, but if someone wanted to read the definitive and the most reliable biography of Sinatra, is there a book that you would recommend?
Yeah, there is not a definitive biography on Frank Sinatra. There is a wonderful book called Frank Sinatra, My Father by Nancy that came out, I think, in 1985. And then she did a book that is so wonderful called Frank Sinatra, an American Original, which is almost like a diary. It goes year by year and it highlights career highlights, personal highlights, etc. And if you really want to know about the relationship with Frank and his family and his children, Tina Sinatra's book, Frank Sinatra, My Father's Daughter, is good. Because as I just said, there's a lot of books written by people that never knew Frank Sinatra, and a lot of stories are handed down and they become, people think they're true and they're actually not true. And with a little diligence, you can find they're not true. And there are people that didn't know him that long. But no, there's not. I don't think there's a definitive biography. There are some good books out there. Bill Zamey, the late writer Bill Zamey, wrote a wonderful book called The Way You Wear Your Hat about the essence and style and character of Frank Sinatra. That's a wonderful book.
So, what about you, Charlie? Do you think you'll ever write your own memoir?
No, I don't think anybody would really care, to be honest with you. I mean, it's interesting when I talk to somebody like you who obviously had done their homework. And, when you listed all those things, a lot of those I've forgotten about because, when you're doing it daily as a work, you forget it. It's pretty impressive, I have to say. I'm humbled listening to it. I no, I don't think that I would ever. I don't think my story is that compelling. I would like, there are. I would like to do one more book maybe on Frank Sinatra if I have that in me. I would like to do it with in conjunction with Tina or Amanda, his granddaughter, sort of, which would be like a biography, like a Sinatra on Sinatra, because we have a lot of him private interviews that he had done over the years, and I utilized that. Some of that you can hear on the HBO documentary we did with Alex Gibney to celebrate his centennial. But
I hope you do it.
we're also, you've done your homework. I'm surprised you haven't asked me about the musical that we've been working
Oh,
on.
that's coming. Some music experts have said that when Frank Sinatra left Tommy Dorsey, he caused the demise of the big bands and he created the era of the teen idol. Do you agree with that?
I think he did. And, and I have some quotes by Tommy Dorsey where Tommy recognized that the people were coming, they were rushing the stage when Frank would sing. I think a lot of that also had to do with the war ending and people coming, men coming back and everything. Frank Sinatra was very lucky because with his career, excuse me, there was radio, the advent of, he designed and invented really the concept album. So he was able to, in the early 50s, put together thematic albums. And there were then the capacity to do an LP where you could do 8 to 10 songs on an album in a theme. He was also very lucky at the time because he was living in the era of those great songwriters, Johnny Mercer, Cole Porter, Harold Arlen, people who have written the Great American Songbook. So there were a lot of things that converged that actually, besides Frank Sinatra's talent, helped propel him to who he is. Also, you can't discount meeting Nelson Riddle, that they were somehow put together at Capitol Records, and Billy May, the great arrangers, because you hear those songs now that Frank did, and they sound like they could have been recorded yesterday. They don't sound dated, they don't sound old. That's kind of the difference of Frank Sinatra, the Columbia, when he was more of a crooner, than Frank Sinatra when he got on Capitol and then started his own label, Reprise. He became, those albums today sound as fresh and as relevant as ever. They don't sound like 1940s big band stuff. But yes, to answer your question, I do think he helped the demise of the big bands. But he also, don't forget, he also worked a lot with the big bands. I mean, when he had his own record label, some of the best records he did were with Count Basie. 2 albums he did with Neil Hefti and Count Basie, and then Quincy Jones, and then Sinatra at the Sands. Then he got to work with Duke Ellington. Frank did embrace the big bands, but yes, I think he helped them. Plus, one more thing that I should mention, you have to realize in those years, those bands had 18, 25 people. Not easy to travel with that. Economically, it's just like today. You can't do 4 or 5 albums like Frank Sinatra did a year with 30 to 60 pieces. It's just not viable. Financially, you couldn't do it. I think America was changing, the war was getting over, and it was harder for people to justify taking a big band out on the road. Certainly Count Basie, who cut down his band, and Duke Ellington, there were certain, and the Dorseys continued, especially Tommy and Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. Frank in 1956 had them open at the Paramount when his movie Johnny Concho was playing at the Paramount Theater. The Dorseys were the stage show, and Frank came out and would do a couple songs with. There was they reunited in '56.
This may be an impossible question, Charlie, but do you have a favorite Frank Sinatra album?
Yeah, that is impossible. It all depends on my mood. People ask me that all the time, specifically about a song. The catalog is so immense and it's so great. I guess if I'm in a real good mood and everything, it was Come Fly With Me, or, You Make Me Feel So Young. And then if you're not in a good mood, you've got Wee Small Hours, you've got Only the Lonely. One of my favorite albums is Sinatra and Strings that he did with first album he did with Don Costa. Another one of my favorite albums that a lot of people don't resonate to is Watertown, that Bob Gaudio wrote, of The Four Seasons wrote for Frank, Watertown, which is really the only pure concept album he did because those songs were written specifically for him and for that album. As I mentioned, when Frank did a concept album in the past, he would pick a theme like travel. And in those days, Sammy Cahn and Jimmy Van Heusen were like his personal songwriters. The formula was they usually would write a new opening song like Come Fly With Me or Only the Lonely and a closing song. And then in between, he would pick great songs like Moonlight in Vermont or Autumn in New York, thematic songs by different writers. To me, Watertown is the pure concept album because Bob Gaudio wrote that specifically, a story with Frank Sinatra in mind for Frank Sinatra to record. We put that out a few years ago for an anniversary, a deluxe edition. And if you're a Frank Sinatra fan, give it another listen. It's wonderful, and I wish it was just more popular with Sinatra fans. It's a wonderful album. The singing on there is just as raw and emotional as on Only the Lonely.
And what about the movies? Do you have a favorite Sinatra movie?
I do. I can't say a favorite, but I certainly I love Robin and the Seven Hoods because of just because of style with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Bing Crosby when they sing style. But I would have to say one of my favorite movies is probably Pal Joey. That is to me the quintessential Frank Sinatra. I just love Pal Joey.
So tell me about the Frank Sinatra musical. What's happening?
Well, the musical is it's again everything with COVID. You know, we had been working on this for a while and gone through several writers, and just last year it premiered in Birmingham Rep in Birmingham, England, and it played there very successfully for a limited run. The idea was then it would go to a West End theater in London and then come to the United States. The London in the West End, there are a list. You can't get a theater in London probably till 2025 or 2026. Unlike Broadway, where there's a lot of turnover because whatever the situation is in New York with the crime or whatever, shows are closing because they're not getting a lot of tourists coming in, and New York can't sustain, just New Yorkers can't keep a play going. You need that tourism to come in. So there's a lot of turnover in Broadway. We probably could go to Broadway if we wanted to, but the idea always was to open in Birmingham and then go to a West End theater. So we're actively now trying to secure a West End theater. So the plan would be that it would go to London and then come to the United States and then eventually tour. Now, it is not a cradle to grave musical. It is specifically a 10 to 11 year period, which we all put our heads together at FSC and said, this we think is the most compelling and entertaining aspect that would make a musical. And it is Frank Sinatra leaving Dorsey. It opens with him at the Paramount as an extra added attraction. Benny Goodman's band was there with Peggy Lee, but Frank was the extra added attraction. So he leaves the confines and the comfort of the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra to go out on his own. And then he has, as we all know, a huge rise. He has 4 or 5 years where he kills those big bands. He becomes a #1 teen idol. He surpasses Bing Crosby, and he is the biggest thing. And then he's beset with personal problems and career problems, and it all comes crashing down. He meets Ava Gardner, and then he pulls everything back together. He does From Here to Eternity. He signs with Capitol Records, and from 1953 on, the guy never looked back, and he was Frank Sinatra, from then on until he stopped. It continues today. I mean, I was very lucky. The last concerts he ever did were in Japan, Fukuoka in 1994. I'd gone there with him. He opened a baseball arena. Natalie Cole was the opening act. This is December 1994. I had always heard that Japanese audiences were very staid, but I'm telling you, I never saw anything like it. I think they knew it was the last time they would see Frank Sinatra. But I saw that all over the world with Frank Sinatra. He would just walk out on stage and people, I've said this before, there's only one other person in my lifetime that I've seen this with, and that would be Bill Clinton. And it's got nothing to do with politics, but Frank Sinatra if he came into a room, it was almost like the molecular structure of the room changed. People would just act differently. Something, this only happened to me once before. Tony Bennett was opening a school that he named the Frank Sinatra School of Arts in Astoria. And Nancy Sinatra and I went for the gala. And as a surprise, Tony had invited Bill Clinton, and we were all eating and watching the show. And there was this buzz around something. And then we see in walks Bill Clinton with some people, sits down at a table. He's the only other person now. Look, I'm a huge Rolling Stones fan. What people can't believe, I've seen every one of their tours since 1988, 89. I just last week saw Billy Joel, who's fantastic, but I've never seen anything like the response Frank Sinatra would get from the audience. And I think it was, he's been part of the American culture for so long. That legacy is everlasting and timeless, but there's a connection because people would go there, families would go there, there'd be grandparents, there'd be parents, there'd be children. So there's a connection when they hear Frank Sinatra to their family.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I read that Frank was introduced to Jack Daniels by Jackie Gleason and Humphrey Bogart. How did the Sinatra Select Jack Daniels whiskey come into being?
You're, boy, you did your homework. Yes, it was. There's conflicting reports that it's Jackie Gleason or Humphrey Bogart. It doesn't really matter. Frank embraced and loved Jack Daniels. For years, he was an unpaid spokesman. I mean, you heard concerts where he does toast and he mentions Jack Daniels. I was lucky enough to meet one of the first Jack Daniels salesmen, a man who's since deceased, Angelo Lucchese. And Angelo would travel around to see Frank Sinatra. And he was friends with Frank Sinatra. In fact, when Frank would go to Australia or places he didn't think that there would have Jack Daniels, Angelo would arrange to have a case put on that plane. So when Frank was traveling overseas, I'm talking about in the 50s, he would have his Jack Daniels with him. I just got to know Angelo from him coming, especially to the Frank Sinatra golf tournaments in the late 80s, early 90s. And we talked for years about there should be a Sinatra liquor. And then I spoke to the family about it and Bob Finkelstein, and we got together with the people at Jack Daniels, and we came up with Sinatra Select, which is hugely popular, and it's a wonderful tribute. This is what I mean when I said along earlier in this interview about authenticity. Frank had a connection with Jack Daniels. It makes sense to have a Sinatra Jack Daniels liquor because he loved the liquor. We actually, when he turned 100, a couple years before that, Bob and I said we really should do something special. So we did a thing called Sinatra Century, which was a very limited edition bottle. And the proof on that was what 100%. But the proof on Sinatra Select, the alcohol proof, is what it was when Frank Sinatra started drinking it, because over the years they've lowered the proof because of alcohol consumption. So there's always an authenticity to something what we do, but it really was the brainchild of Angelo Lucchese, bless his soul, who said we really have to do something to honor Frank Sinatra. They had given Frank they'd made him a member. They have a little thing called the Squires Club where they made Frank, and he had a jacket that said Jack Daniels. They also had given him, I think, an acre of land on the distillery. But Angelo said, if it wasn't for this man, it was publicity we could never pay for. So it was only because of the relationship with Angelo Lucchese that we came up with Sinatra Select.
Yeah, it's a brilliant concept and it happens to be a great drink. What do you think Frank would think of the music industry today, Charlie?
Well, that's a good question, Harvey. I don't know. I think he would embrace it. I think he would be amazed at the people that are listening and streaming his music. I think he would take great pride in that he still is relevant. People are still listening to it. But I think he would probably not be happy that artists are not able to make as many albums as he were able to make in those years. And there's not the musicianship. A lot more of it has moved to electronics. Frank always loved, even when they were doing the duets album. I'm sure you've heard this story or read about it, but when they did the first sessions and he walked into Capitol Records, he hadn't been there for years. And Phil Ramone, who was the producer, a great guy, had built like an isolation booth in the middle of the studio. And Frank said, I'm leaving. I'll come back when you take that down. I want to be like I used to record standing by Bill Miller, hear the piano. I want to hear the velocity of the band, and I want to do it that way. So they spent a couple nights and probably $100,000 to tear down that booth that was specifically made, an isolation booth. So, but I do think Frank Sinatra, like I said, he was always looking forward. So I don't think he would be a curmudgeon about it. He might be a little dismayed about the electronics of it, but I think he would embrace the. He was a musician. He was an artist. He would love the music industry.
So you mentioned looking forward. So when I look at the future and the long-term plan for the administration of the Sinatra estate and the Sinatra brand, are there any Sinatra grandchildren that will take over Frank Sinatra Enterprises when all of us are gone?
Well, there are. I mean, I'm sure somebody's thinking of contingency plans because Bob and I are getting up there in years, and it, Bob, Tina, and myself. I mean, I'm a couple decades younger than them, but I'm old. I'm 57.
That's not old, Charlie. I'm 10 years older than you.
Don't look it, my friend. Uh, yes, and also you have to realize half of the company is owned by Warner Music Group, and so hopefully it will live on, and hopefully, like I said, I think Frank Sinatra, as long as there are human beings and people with emotion, Frank Sinatra will always be relevant. And as I said, the music today is just as popular as it was. People are gravitating towards it. So we had one of our best years last year. So I think the future is endless, and not to keep harping on this pun, but the best is yet to come. I don't know if you're going to mention it because you're always one step ahead of me because I said you're very, very good. I watched some of your interviews about your diligence and your education about your guests. But we did a restaurant this year. We will celebrate in April 1 year in Nashville, in Printers Alley. And we have a Sinatra Bar and Lounge. It unbelievable to all of us how successful that has been, how it has resonated with people. All you have to do is Google it. One of the top restaurants in Nashville, Bars and Lounges, one of the top. Our partner, who happens to be named Bill Miller, just sent me a thing a couple of days ago. It's named one of the most romantic places to have dinner in Nashville. And at first, there was a little reluctance on the part to do it there. But I said it's Music City. And I said to Tina Sinatra, your father played the Grand Ole Opry in 1976. I have a tape of it and I have reviews of it. And anybody who was anybody in Nashville went to see your dad. So Music City, I think we should be here. And it's wonderful how people just love it. If you're ever in Nashville, let me know, be our guest. But it's a wonderful restaurant and it's just great. I mean, I have to tell you, having done this for so many years, I'm astounded by how successful it has been and how people will call me that are going to Nashville and they can't get a reservation, or they're in Nashville and they want to go there for. I've never seen. We also have a restaurant at the Wynn, at the Encore at the Wynn Sinatra, which is one of the most popular restaurants in that hotel casino. And again, I think it's just that people, again, it's because we're authentic and we don't have a lot of them, and they're all very special. And we work very hard to try to do things right. I mean, we never want to fail, as I said, because we take that position. What was Frank if Frank was here? So,
Well, that it really shows, Charlie. You know, I have to say, I haven't been to the restaurant in Nashville, but I have been to the one at the Wynn. I hope you open a restaurant in New York because I can see it. I can just see it. And the other thing is the Sinatra channel on Sirius XM, which is really, it's constantly playing in my car whenever I'm driving. Doesn't Nancy have a show on there too?
does, and I do some shows there. You're probably sick of hearing me on there, right?
No, I love that channel because it's not just Frank. You play Peggy Lee, Tony Bennett, a lot of the other contemporaries, and it's the Great American Songbook. It's just the most wonderful channel on Sirius XM. And you know, people like Michael Bublé have opened up a whole new generation of interest in Sinatra because he's always paying tribute to Sinatra.
Yeah, you're great at what you do because you hit right on that. When we were approached to do that channel, the idea was they wanted 24/7 of Frank. And Bob Finkelstein, myself, and Tina all said, And they looked at me about the catalog. I said, oh, if we do 24/7 of Frank, in 3 days, we'll be repeating. You'll hear the catalog. The idea was to make it a lifestyle channel with the Great American Songbook because everybody gravitates toward Frank. So you can hear Nat Cole, you can hear Peggy Lee, you can hear Dean Martin, you can hear Tony Bennett, you can hear Michael Bublé. I just came back from New York 3 days ago, and last Wednesday or Thursday, I did an interview with Rod Stewart. He's got another standard swing album coming out. Our channel is the premier channel. But I will tell you, because Tina and I are really involved in running that channel. We have a great guy named Brian Nicola, who's our engineer, and Lou Simon, who's the program director. But what we get monthly, weekly, before people would say, we want, because on Friday, if you listen to the channel, the first Friday of every month is Fridays with Frank, where it's 24/7 of Frank. And the only complaint we get on that channel is, we want to hear more Frank. We want 24/7 of Frank. So Sirius came to us a couple of years ago and said, we've been able to expand and open on digital range on our app. We're going to do special channels. So a few years ago, we debuted a new channel called Perfectly Frank, which is 24/7 of Frank Sinatra that's on the app. And I will tell you and break news to you that this spring we will have a third channel, Sinatra channel, that will be like Perfectly Frank. I can't tell you what the format will be. Of course, it's going to be Sinatra, but it'll be an app-only channel, which nowadays, because cars don't have CDs in them anymore, to my dismay, if you have the app on your phone, you can just Bluetooth it and you can hear it in the car. But we will be debuting. I mean, again, this is another thing like the restaurant. Sometimes I'm too close to it. I love the music of Frank Sinatra. I love the man. I love the music. I'm overwhelmed at the reception. And when people come up to me and say, like you did, that they listen to the channel, or people will call me and say, I don't like what you played on the channel. It is so great that people are into that channel. I hear that more than anything else, the Seriously Sinatra, they love the channel. And they love not just hearing Frank, but as you mentioned, hearing Peggy Lee and hearing Nat Cole and people that you would never hear on the radio today if it wasn't for Seriously Sinatra.
Well, I have an idea for you for that channel. You want to hear it?
Absolutely, unless you want to tell me when we're off podcast in case you don't want anybody.
I want to give you this idea. I think it would be really cool if interspersed, maybe after every 10th song, you had a fan, a little snippet from a fan expressing why Sinatra meant so much to them. I'm going to tell you something now. My very favorite Sinatra song is Let Me Try Again, and particularly the live version from the Main Event album. And the reason is because, as you know, prior to me starting this show, I was a criminal and family court judge for 26 years. And in Canada, you have to be interviewed for that job. So the first time I went for a job interview to become a judge, I didn't get it because they said I was too young. I was 36. So 2 years later, I get invited back to an interview, and I'm very nervous because I'm only 2 years older. And I kept playing Let Me Try Again, that live version. And that song, his delivery of that song live, that electricity, energized me. And I went into that interview with that spirit from that song, and I got the job and I became a judge. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could hear fans, in a 30-second little clip about something about Frank that really moved them or was life-altering? So I'll leave you with that suggestion.
That's a great suggestion. In fact, there is a thing, you will hear a call to action sometimes where they say, call or email with us. I mean, we do something similar, but it's not as good as your idea where there are celebrities talking about Frank Sinatra, because when we do the playing favorites or shows, they always want to get little bumpers, and you'll hear Josh Groban talks about or Michael Bublé. But I'll tell you what, the next time our paths cross, if you're in LA or I'm in New York, you and I will do it in conversation show or a playing favorite show. You can do it for Sirius since you listen to the channel. Be happy.
I would love that. Well, I got to tell you, Charlie, it's been such a pleasure meeting you, talking about everybody's favorite male vocalist. Thank you for everything you do to perpetuate and honor Frank Sinatra's legacy and his body of work. And thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
It's certainly my pleasure. And we should thank Harriet Schock, who made the introduction. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here. But I appreciate you reaching out, and I appreciate taking the time. And as I said before, I've been interviewed by a lot of people. You really knew what you were talking about, and you did your homework, and I sincerely appreciate that more than you know, because using Frank Sinatra as the case, there's a lot of stories that are not true and get blown out of proportion. You knew everything, and you asked very intelligent questions, and that's really refreshing in this day and age.
Thank you so much for that, Charlie. It means the world to me. It was easy to do because I'm a great fan. Thank you again. Our guest has been Charles Pignone, Senior Vice President of Frank Sinatra Enterprises. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to my producer, Steve Silver, my Director of Programming, Deborah Batsafin, my production assistant, Rosa Apuzzo, my PR directors, Eileen Shapiro and Jimmy Starr, and my entire team at the XPTV1 network in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.